Kaya naga kajak koja nungamort. Kurawe yeye kayen nijaboja. So I want to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which this campus has been built, and which was taken from them without their consent, treaty or compensation. This land has always been a learning space for many Aboriginal nations, and as teachers and learners we can draw strength and guidance from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge, one of the oldest knowledge systems in the world. To begin, can you turn to the person next to you or behind you or in front and greet them in English? Now turn to someone else and greet them in another language or in English, but in another way. So, what are we here for today? What's the purpose of this lecture on this topic? Make a note of your ideas, and as you are listening, go back to this question. We will come back to this at the very end of this lecture. Australians are diverse in many ways, including linguistically. And language use is one of the few areas where prejudice remains socially acceptable and often goes unnoticed. In this lecture, I have three aims in no particular order. One is to reflect on linguistic prejudice in Australian education and society more broadly. Two, to challenge the inequity and misunderstandings related to linguistic diversity. And three, to share some pedagogical strategies that value the languages that students bring to the classroom and reduce the language barrier for multilingual students. So I will begin with a snapshot of linguistic diversity in Australia. Then I'll share some of the ways we can value the languages that learners bring with them into the classrooms and reduce the language barrier that many students experience. Then we will consider common attitudes to language, including why we value some languages and dialects more than others. This will take us to consider what linguistic prejudice is and how it leads to discrimination and the effects of this. Finally, I answer the question, what can we do? And we finish by reflecting on the purpose of this lecture. So, where would you go if you wanted some data about linguistic diversity in Australia? Yep, the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So for now, I'm relying on the data from the 2016 census. So let's begin with Australian languages. 150 Australian Indigenous languages were spoken in homes in 2016. Here's a map that estimates the languages and number of speakers and the geographical regions in which they are spoken. So 1 in 10 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person speaks at least one Australian Indigenous language at home. Many more also speak a Creole and Aboriginal English, which is a distinct and codified variety of English. Overall, there are 150 migrant languages spoken in Australian homes, including English. After English, the next most common languages are Mandarin, Arabic, Cantonese, and Vietnamese. This data then tells us that 1 in 4 school-aged children speak a language or dialect in addition to English. Finally, let's talk about Englishes. 70% of Australians speak English at home. Around 30% were born overseas and do not speak Australian English, and certainly not standard Australian English. British, Irish, Scottish, Indian, New Zealand English are among the most common Englishes spoken by the overseas-born population. Englishes, yes, I'm using this as a plural, and yes, it is correct. You will find out why in a minute. So, which English is taught? Maybe which English should be taught? General Australian English is considered the standard vernacular in Australia, that is, the spoken language of Australia. And according to ACARA, Standard Australian English is the language of the education system in Australia. Australian English is just one of the many varieties of the English language, and it has a distinctive accent, vocabulary, and style. Australian English differs to varying degrees from other varieties and dialects of English in terms of grammar, spelling, and pronunciation. So these two images show the huge diversity within the English language in the British Isles and around the world. On the right, you see an image of World Standard Englishes, which is all the varieties of English that are currently spoken all around the world. So, alongside the 150 First Nation languages spoken, the 150 migrant languages, each with their own various dialects, including English, we can expect our students to be linguistically diverse. So what does that mean for us as teachers? Yep, what it means is that all teachers are teaching language with every interaction they have with students. By the same token, all students are learners of standard Australian English. Being aware of this linguistic diversity means that we need to consider the language we use in class and whether it's being understood by our students. We can also use intentional, ethical, pedagogical actions that are known to improve educational outcomes for students who are learners of standard Australian English. So, to reduce the language barrier, we can provide supporting structures. In their 215 book chapter, Jennifer Hammond and Pauline Gibbons tell us that teachers need to provide temporary supporting structures that assist learners to develop new understandings, concepts and abilities. And as learners acquire these skills, teachers then need to withdraw that support only to provide further support for extended or new tasks in particular. Pauline Gibbons, in her later 2015 publication, reminds us that it is important that when providing these supporting structures, that we do not position these students as if they are somehow deficit. They have just not had sufficient time or opportunity to develop the language of the education system. And in order for the classroom to be equitable for them, they need temporary supporting structures. So, to reduce the language barrier, we can provide these supporting structures. And what do they look like? How do we scaffold? So, many language teaching approaches and techniques can be used to scaffold language in mainstream classes. So, for example, when scaffolding a viewing activity, you can preview the content or topic of a text using prediction and by asking referential questions before the viewing and using images to support this. So for example, we might ask students to look at this image and tell us what they know about climate change and what aspect of climate change they expect the video to be about. Okay, we can use the image as a prompt. Referential questions are questions that you don't know the answer to. So for example, it could be something like, have you ever seen any visible signs of climate change yourself? Tell your classmates what you have seen. We can also ask students to preview vocabulary via meaning-focused tasks, such as in this example here provided. In this activity, the students are given the vocabulary, some core vocabulary expressions and phrases. You can see in particular we don't just look at one-word items, and then students are asked to combine them together to make a summary, which is a kind of prediction. We can also use these strategies to overcome the language barrier and to help students demonstrate their content knowledge in assessment activities, such as in the first example here, where we provide sentence stems for the students alongside images as well, so giving them the opportunity to get started. And in the other example here, where we're using picture sorts for lower levels in science classes, and we can also activate language schema before an assessment task by a discussion activity. If the English used in assessments is too far beyond the student's language proficiency or relies heavily on jargon, then this can create inaccurate test results, unless our intention is to assess language and content. And these types of strategies can be helpful for all learners, regardless of their language background. We can also reduce the language barrier via differentiation. And some examples here of differentiation, we can see that we can provide a range of text types to suit the various levels of the learners. So a lot of visuals and text for lower levels, and also different genres as well can be easier or more difficult to read. And when I say genre, I mean, for example, a newspaper article versus a blog, or versus student-produced text as well. And of course, the kind of activities or tasks that we get students to do, if we vary those, we can use the same text, but the task is adapted for the different levels. So we can have summaries and inference at higher levels, and perhaps vocabulary work and locating information at lower levels. And we can also ask students to create their own comprehension questions so they know the level that they're at, and the activity can be made differentiated in that way. So I want to end this section by going back to the idea that scaffolding language is not about dumbing things down for the purposes of remediation. Luciano Mariani, his often cited model of scaffolding, is underpinned by the idea that learners need autonomy in order to become agentic, capable and independent learners. Mariani argues for the high challenge, high support in scaffolding student learning. Learners need to be challenged within tasks and with tasks which are well beyond their present individual capacity. Low challenge tasks will result in busy work, emotionally and cognitively disengaged students, or students being unable to cope with the not knowing that all learners need to be able to manage. So if we never challenge them, then they're never going to develop the skills that are necessary to learn. In contrast, we know that high challenge tasks can be much more powerfully motivating. However, to successfully engage in and complete high challenge tasks, students also need high support. If students feel that the task is impossible or unreasonable, of course, they'll become emotional, they may become emotionally overwhelmed, frustrated, lose confidence and interest. Conversely, low challenge tasks can be perceived as irrelevant or uninteresting, again leading to feelings of boredom and disengagement. This high challenge, high support approach to scaffolding facilitates language and learning by viewing all learners as capable. It enhances the learner's sense of agency by encouraging autonomy and independence. So, in addition to this, we should also take action to actively value the languages and varieties of languages and English that learners bring to the classroom. So look at this road sign, for example. This is a simple example of valuing linguistic diversity. It replaces the English name with the Pidgin Jarrah name, which is a distinct dialect of the Western Desert language. We can replicate this in our own classrooms by including texts and signs written in the languages and dialects of our students alongside standard Australian English. How else can we value our learners' linguistic diversity within the classroom? Well, we can encourage students to rewrite texts in English into their own dialects or languages and vice versa. We can compare differences in language use without reinforcing the notion of a correct English. We just want to encourage the idea that we use language in different ways in different contexts. This pedagogy has a particular name, and we call it translanguaging. Translanguaging emerged as a highly significant pedagogy in bilingual education in North America. So according to Ofelia Garcia, translanguaging is two things. One, it's what bilingual or multilingual children do when they are able to use all the language they know without suppressing any of these languages. Two, it's also a way of teaching, a pedagogy that builds on the natural strategies that bilingual children have. It allows them to read in one language and discuss or write in another. A pedagogy that allows them to use all the language they have to make meaning and to learn. Before I give you some practical ideas, I want to remind you that in the context of learning standard Australian English, and in particular the written language, then we can say that all students are learners of standard written Australian English. Okay, so here are some of the strategies. I'm sure you can create your own strategies too. So we need to make that classroom a safe space for students to draw on all the languages they use, and that means including this actively in the classroom. We can assign bilingual reading and writing partners who share the same home language and dialect. We can use contrastive analysis where we compare different features of languages that are similar and different. This can be across different languages, across different dialects, or across different registers and genres, such as the distinct differences between written and spoken language. And we can also encourage and allow the use of home languages for learning. So I'm sure you can create your own strategies. Just go back to first principles. What can I do to value students' languages? Okay, so time to move on now to talk about attitudes to language. Has anyone ever told you not to speak your first language or dialect in Australia? If not, English is probably your first language and you are likely to have come from a high socioeconomic background. But if I ask, has anyone ever corrected or commented on your grammar, vocabulary or pronunciation, then your answer might be yes. And if so, you would not be alone. So the idea that there's a proper way to speak any particular language, and in this case English, has been around for a long time. In fact, goes back to a story in the Bible of the shibboleth, if you're interested. But anyway, here's a screenshot from My Fair Lady. This is a film that was based on the play Pygmalion, which was written by British playwright George Bernard Shaw. And it was an exploration of class division and social mobility, and a satire, actually. So in the photo, we see Professor Higgins teaching Eliza, who's a flower girl from the East End of London. He's teaching her to speak proper English, which is the standard language of the powerful Professor Higgins. Watching this as a child, I didn't understand that this was satire that was criticising the idea of a correct way to speak English. And I internalised the idea that if I could speak properly, like Professor Higgins, I would be more acceptable. So as a native speaker of British English, how was it possible that Eliza and millions of other people were considered to not speak proper English? There are a number of potential answers to this question. So in terms of language, or in terms of communication, everything, in terms of communication, we all do it. We language, right? Yeah, I'm using that as a verb, not a noun. But humans do not only use language, we do something that no other animal does. We comment on the language we use. Maybe we don't like a particular pronunciation of a word, or we don't like the features of a particular dialect, so we look down on it. Maybe we think that think should only be pronounced with a th, think, and never f, think, or t, tink, or that it's proper to enunciate the ing at the end of words like running and swimming. Renowned applied linguist Deborah Cameron calls this verbal hygiene. So let's take a moment to begin by searching for and acknowledging the pedant that lurks within all of us. So we're all a bit pedantic when it comes to language. Have you ever wanted to correct someone else's language? I think you would not be alone. So let's take some time now for you to share some of your pet peeves about how other people use language. So according to Deborah Cameron, practices like these seem to come from the desire to improve or clean up language, and they may or may not be harmful. Other applied linguists take a stronger view, and they say that it reflects prejudice and bigotry and shouldn't be tolerated. Tove Skotnet-Kangas, for example, calls it linguicism. What do you think? And what about attitudes to accents? We all have distinct feelings about the way other people speak. For example, we find some accents unpleasant while we are attracted to others. Which accents do you like? Which do you dislike? Can you think of any reasons for your preferences? We also make judgments about people based on how they speak, even if we can't see them. For example, we find some styles of speaking stuffy or posh and make unfavourable judgments about the speakers, such as finding them stuck up. In contrast, we believe that some speakers sound more truthful and honest. We also have expectations about the way people ought to speak on the basis of gender, social status, educational background, profession, age, and so on. For example, how are teachers supposed to speak? How are plumbers supposed to speak? Compare broadcasters of classical music programs with the speech patterns and accents of sports commentators. So how we speak conveys a message to the world about who we are. What judgments would you make about the speakers you've just heard? Which speaking style did you prefer? So the modern study of language has shown that all native speakers of a language are experts in their language. And almost all judgments about someone's language, the so-called unattractiveness of a particular accent or the correctness of grammar, have no linguistic justification. All languages and dialects are complex, sophisticated. They have stable pattern speakers that enable speakers of the language to express themselves fully and communicate with one another. Yet such attitudes persist and are often institutionalized and can be particularly problematic when someone is speaking English as a second language. They may well be a fluent user, but still attitudes towards language can really be prejudiced against that person. And these different types of attitudes persist, and they are often institutionalized. And this is most obviously the case in education. So if a child, for example, persists in using non-standard language, whether that child is a speaker of English as a first, second or third language, particularly non-standard grammar, that child will be disadvantaged. And this is true for all learners who use English in a so-called non-standard way. So why are we so hung up on speaking standard languages? So we'll have to go back to our map. To go back to our map of the British dialects to think about this. Which dialect of English is the most prestigious and why? It would be the dialect of, it comes from the dialect of the southeastern of the UK, and particularly from an area in the UK called Oxford. So standard British English pronunciation that we call RP, received pronunciation, is based on the southeastern dialects, and these are spoken by powerful people, rich, wealthy, high socioeconomic status, and historically probably people who belonged to the aristocracy. And standard Australian English is heavily influenced by this. And in terms of the origins of the standard language, it's true in many other contexts such as France, Japan, Indonesia and China. So the standard language is defined by power and status, not by any special linguistic features. So standard languages developed to improve communication across communities with different languages and dialects within a country. And the development of a standard written language, of course, is tied to mass education and literacy. But the choice of the standard is determined by the powerful. And let's not forget that in many situations, it could be a language that's been imposed by others via the process of colonization. So those of us within a community who do not use the standard language are often disadvantaged and are more likely to experience linguistic prejudice and discrimination. So prejudice is part of everyday life, and it's present everywhere, including in our education system. So sociolinguistic research explores the relationship between language and power, and this research provides evidence to support the view that linguistic prejudice is systemic in some countries, particularly in those that were colonized. It is, we can say that it is rooted in power structures. It is hegemonic. That is, the values of one group dominates over those of another, and over time these values become normalized and accepted uncritically. We don't even notice. For example, we might argue that the English language and culture is hegemonic in Australia. Its spread cannot be separated from British colonialism, which imposed British language, culture and values on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and others, which continues to date. So Linguistic prejudice can be viewed as hegemonic, and if we happen by chance to be members of the dominant group, we will most likely unconsciously and often unintentionally maintain and reinforce prejudices that serve our own interests and those of the dominant group. So as teachers, we have to navigate this kind of complex terrain to balance out the desire for students to become literate with the prejudices that we know are being reinforced and which may be harmful. In education, linguistic prejudice is not only experienced by students, but teachers can be discriminated against too. So let's look at a recent example of linguistic prejudice from the UK. So I chose this example as it applies to teacher training and to my own experience growing up in an Irish working class migrant family in the north of England. The study showed that trainee teachers in the UK from the North and Midlands were being told by their mentors to adopt a more general, less broad version of their accents. Has this ever happened to you? Have you ever been told to speak properly as a trainee teacher? Have you ever tried to modify your accent, grammar, pronunciation, word choice? Is there a proper English? Well, no. But different contexts require different language. As a teacher, I speak one way, to friends another, to my children another way, and to the policeman who pulled me over for speeding last week another way. Okay. Similarly, I write differently in an academic paper, in an email, in a tweet. So, simply stated, linguistic prejudice refers to the preconceived negative attitudes that people can have about an entire category of individuals based on their use of language. So we'll have a bit of a lighter side here before we move on to linguistic discrimination. Nobody discriminated against Yoda, okay? Why not? The way he speaks is seen as a powerful marker of his identity, and people came to love it and embrace it. If people can accept and embrace the language of Yoda, perhaps they should start to do that for actual people too. And then perhaps we can reduce the prejudice and its consequences. So linguistic discrimination takes the beliefs and feelings involved in linguistic prejudice and turns them into actions. Linguistic discrimination manifests itself in the negative or distinct treatment of individuals due to the way they use language. For example, via people not being given an interview for a job or rejected when they apply to rent a house on the basis of their accent, and of course the prejudices that are attached to this. In terms of education, there are myriad ways in which children are discriminated against, and these have long-lasting effects. So just like racism, sexism, ableism, ageism, and all other forms of discrimination, linguistic discrimination causes persistent and measurable negative consequences which affect all aspects of people's lives. So people will have a measurable lower level of wealth, people will attain lower levels of education, people are less likely to get work and be unemployed, and when they do get work, the pay will tend to be in lower status jobs, even when that person actually has a high level of background. In terms of health outcomes, we know that people who, in particular, who do not speak standard language in Australia have worse health outcomes than those who don't. And finally, we know that people are more likely to be unable to defend themselves in cases of where crime is involved, but we also know that language plays a part in a person's ability to, in a person's capacity, for example, to participate even in the legal system, and so can lead to quite significant discrimination, which can lead to often to unfair imprisonment as well. So, what can we do? Well, first, if you want to learn more about the incredible ways that society changes language and language shapes society, then you can enroll in a unit that we have here, which is LST 6282, and this is called Using Language, and it's taught by Dr. Anne Thwaite. She studied under world-renowned sociolinguist M.A.K. Halliday at Sydney University. That's one thing you can do. And in relation to my image here, just remind yourself that equal treatment does not correspond to equality unless students can understand the language of instruction. And that if students' languages are not welcome and valued in classrooms, this sends the message that this part of their identities is not important. Under the Australian curriculum and the Melbourne Declaration, schools are obligated to provide the support that students who use English as an additional language or dialect need to put them on an equal footing with other students. So learn and teach the intercultural understanding curriculum and put a copy of the Melbourne Declaration in your classrooms and staff rooms. The Melbourne Declaration, its first goal is that Australian schooling promotes equity and excellence. Schooling contributes to a socially cohesive society that respects and appreciates cultural, social and religious diversity. This means that all schools must provide all students with access to high quality schooling that is free from discrimination based on language or culture. The second goal of the Melbourne Declaration is that all young Australians become successful learners, confident and creative individuals, active and informed citizens. This means that students are able to make sense of their world and think about how things have become the way they are. So be an advocate for students who speak another language or dialect of English. Advocacy means concrete actions in the classroom. Encourage students to bring their language into the classroom, into their learning, and value those languages and the related cultural values, beliefs and behaviours that they are entwined with. Explore discrimination, equality and social justice in relation to language with students. Talk about attitudes to language and show students that standard English is just another language. It should not replace their existing languages or dialects. It's just a way of communicating that is common in particular contexts. You also need to be aware that for some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the imposition of English in education only serves as a reminder of the language and culture that was taken from them via colonisation. As teachers, you can identify linguistic prejudice and call it out. If your school or colleagues are unintentionally marginalising or discriminating against particular students by insisting on standard English or English only in the classroom, or by sending students off for remediation, speak up. If students from key equity groups are being singled out and labelled in discriminatory ways, speak up. Finally, we need to identify and challenge the institutional practices that create and maintain inequity, as well as enacting intentional ethical pedagogies that are underpinned by a genuine intention to create equity in our classrooms. So to finish, I want to take you back to the question I asked you at the beginning of this lecture, which was to consider the purpose of this lecture. Go back to your notes and have a look. What did you write as the purpose, and what do you think the purpose is now? You can pause to do that. So finally, I want to share with you what I think the overall purpose of this lecture is, which was to raise awareness of the power of language to liberate and discriminate, and to show how some learners will be advantaged by the language used in class, while others will be oppressed and discriminated against because of the language and varieties of English that they bring to class. Here is a list of references. I hope you found something that will be relevant and useful for you in your role as teachers. Thank you. And goodbye.